Okay, so wow, you guys sent in a ton of stuff about this shootout in Johannesburg
Yeah.
at Solo Sandton.
Yeah.
Articles, social media posts, you name it. And honestly, it's crazy.
It is wild.
Like multiple bodyguards, no firearms policy,
Yeah.
and it all goes so wrong.
It's definitely a huge tragedy. There's no doubts about that. And I think it really shines a light on a lot of issues surrounding security and nightlife culture, particularly in a city like Johannesburg.
Absolutely, to get everyone up to speed. This happened at Solo Sandton, which is a restaurant.
Right.
And, a man tried to get in with his bodyguards and things escalated with security personnel ending in a shootout.
Wow.
And tragically, two of his bodyguards and two patrons who were caught in the crossfire died.
Yeah, and what we know is that the police found 2 AK-47 rifles and 2 handguns at the scene. So
Yeah.
right there, that tells you this wasn't just some small altercation. This is serious firepower.
Absolutely. And I was noticing in the forum, some people were saying that Solo isn't just a restaurant, that later at night it kind of transitions into more of a bar or club.
Right.
There.
It definitely adds another layer to the situation. You've got a change in atmosphere, maybe a change in crowd coming in. So it creates a really kind of dynamic and volatile environment for security to handle. And, the risks can escalate pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's like as the night goes on, the stakes get higher.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
speaking of high stakes, let's talk about the man at the center of all of this.
Okay.
So Sfamandla Mabonga,
Sfamandla Mabonga.
yeah, he was London's ex. And from what we can tell from the sources you sent, he wasn't exactly known for being a rule follower.
Right.
Not only was he carrying firearms, which is a direct violation of the restaurant's policy, but he was actually banned from Solo previously.
Wait, he was banned?
Yeah.
So this wasn't his first time having a run-in?
No, it seems not.
With Solo.
And when we look a little bit deeper, a picture starts to emerge. From what we can tell from the forum posts and articles, we see Sfamandla as this figure that really liked to flaunt his wealth. And it seems that he operated with a sense of impunity, like he didn't think the rules applied to him.
And it doesn't seem like this is his first time being involved in a violent incident either.
No, sadly not. The sources that you sent also mentioned another incident at Tempo.
Tempo.
Yeah, a club in Rivonia where Sfamandla was shot and hospitalized. And there are also accounts of him clashing with security at Konka in Soweto.
So a bit of a pattern.
It definitely seems like there's a pattern of behavior there that suggests that he had a real disregard for authority and kind of a tendency towards confrontation.
Yeah, this is all painting a pretty intense picture so far. And I think it's clear that this incident wasn't just random. It kind of points to maybe a larger culture, a clash of lifestyles even, because there's this mention of Solo attracting a certain crowd, like young, wealthy elite.
Right.
And a lot of people online are saying that this shootout really exposes a darker side to that whole scene.
I think it's really important to be careful about painting entire groups of people with a broad brush. But you're right, this incident does raise questions about security and nightlife culture, particularly among certain circles in Johannesburg. And there's a really interesting aspect of this that's highlighted in some of the forums that you sent, and they're talking about the use of what they call proxy security companies.
Proxy security companies. I've never heard of that. What is that?
So imagine this. You've got wealthy individuals in Johannesburg, the type of people that would frequent a place like Solo. They're employing private security firms, not just for personal protection, but also as a way to settle disputes or project an image of power.
So it's not about security. It's about sending a message.
In some ways, it's definitely blurring the lines, because when security firms start becoming entangled in these personal power plays, it becomes hard to distinguish, legitimate security measures from outright aggression.
Right. And especially with South Africa's already, high rate of gun violence, you're adding even more fuel to that fire. It's almost like these firms become extensions of these personal entourages rather than, being there for actual safety.
Exactly. And it raises this question of who's really in control, because if you've got a security firm that's acting on behalf of someone like Sfamandla, who we already know has a history of disregarding the rules, the potential for things to go wrong is huge. I think this case really shines a light on the dangers of this type of system, and it also forces us to examine this bigger picture of gun violence in South Africa and the challenges that law enforcement face.
It's a lot to unpack. And, another thing that stood out to me while we were going through this material is that this shootout happened despite police being nearby.
Right.
So it makes you wonder about police response times and the effectiveness of the security measures, particularly in, these high-end establishments.
Absolutely. And that same concern is reflected in a lot of the forum posts you send, where people are talking about how, armed security in these venues is becoming so normalized that it's actually making people feel uneasy.
Yeah, you go out to have a good time and suddenly you're surrounded by armed guards and the potential for, a shootout,
Mm.
it makes you really question, like, what does it mean to feel safe in these spaces?
Yeah, and it also brings up this question of oversight, who's making sure that these private security companies are operating ethically and legally. There's an organization in South Africa, PSAERA, the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority. They're responsible for things like licensing training and setting standards for the industry, but their effectiveness is a topic of huge debate in the
You
forums.
can see why when you have incidents like this, it makes you
Mm.
wonder, do they have the resources, the authority to really keep this industry in check? Especially when you consider, the potential for corruption lurking in the background.
Yeah, that potential for corruption is a real concern whenever you've got an industry that involves power money access, strong oversight is crucial to make sure that things don't spiral out of control.
So we've got this very complex situation, tragic incident, questions about security culture, this whole system of private protection that seems to be operating in a bit of a gray area.
Yeah.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of gun violence and social inequalities that are, deeply ingrained in South African society.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. This isn't just one event in isolation. This is a symptom of a much bigger, more complex problem. And unpacking that problem requires us to look at it from multiple perspectives.
Right. You're absolutely right. This isn't just about analyzing a tragic event. It's about understanding the factors that contribute to it and how we can move forward.
Yeah, and that involves asking difficult questions, having these open conversations, and really challenging the status quo.
And those conversations need to involve everyone, policymakers, security professionals, the businesses themselves, the communities that they operate in.
Absolutely. It's about working together to create a society where people feel safe and respected regardless of background or social standing.
Where security measures don't escalate into violence, and there's a clear line between protection and power plays.
Well said. A vision worth striving for.
And that's what we're trying to do here, delve a little deeper, understand the nuances, and hopefully spark some of those conversations that lead to positive change.
That's what it's all about.
It's interesting, diving deeper into this whole world of private security in South Africa, you realize it's a huge industry.
Yeah.
And, when you consider the crime statistics and just general safety concerns in the country, it's understandable why people, especially those who can afford it, turn to these companies for a sense of protection.
It's a natural response to a problem that people are facing, but the fact that it's tied to affordability really raises a whole set of different questions about, equity and access to safety.
Right.
We see this playing out in other parts of the world too, where as the gap between the haves and the have-nots widens, that reliance on private security increases. So it creates this kind of two-tiered system.
Right. So the wealthy can buy themselves protection that other people can't afford, which just further divides society.
Exactly. It reinforces those inequalities that already exist, and it can breed resentment and distrust. And as we've seen in this case, it can escalate into violence.
And it all kind of goes back to those proxy security companies you were talking about earlier.
Right.
I'm still kind of stuck on that concept. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Like, what are the specific dangers of using security firms in that way?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that not all private security companies operate this way. There are many that provide a genuine service protecting people and property within the bounds of the law, but it's when those companies get pulled into personal disputes or when they're used as tools for projecting power, that's where the problems start to arise.
So instead of preventing violence, they actually become a part of it.
Yeah, in a way, instead of focusing solely on de-escalation and protection, they might be used to intimidate others or even carry out acts of aggression on behalf of their clients.
Right. It becomes like this weird gray area between security and almost like vigilantism.
Exactly.
So who's accountable? If a firm is acting like a private army for someone like Sfermandla when things go wrong, who takes the blame?
That's the big question. And it brings us back to PSIR, the regulatory body that we talked about earlier. They have a huge task in front of them. They have to make sure that these companies are properly licensed, that their personnel are well-trained, and that they're all adhering to these ethical guidelines.
But from what we saw in the forums, there's a lot of debate about whether they're actually effective at monitoring and enforcing those standards across such a big industry, especially when you add in the potential for corruption.
You're right. The potential for corruption is very real, and it's something that PSIA needs to address head on. It's not just about having rules in place. It's about making sure that you have the resources, the capacity to investigate, and the political will to actually hold people accountable, even if they're wealthy or influential.
It strikes me that this whole conversation we're having about private security kind of mirrors some of the bigger debates about gun control in South Africa in general.
Yeah, right.
Where there are legitimate reasons for ownership or use, but there's also this very real potential for things to go wrong with tragic consequences.
Absolutely. It's a good observation, and it really emphasizes the complexity of these issues. There's no easy answer, there's no quick fix. But I think what this incident at Solo Sandton does is it really forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths and have these tough conversations.
Right.
We can't shy away from examining the systems that are in place and trying to identify the weaknesses so we can work towards solutions that prioritize public safety and accountability.
And maybe part of that conversation also needs to be about how do we address these underlying social and economic problems that fuel the demand for private security in the first place?
Absolutely. Things like poverty and inequality and lack of opportunity all contribute to this climate of fear, and investing in things like education, job creation, and social programs that can really go a long way in building a more just and equitable society, which in turn can lead to a decrease in crime and less reliance on these private security companies as a solution.
So it's not just about reacting to the symptoms, it's about actually fixing the root cause.
Exactly. It requires this holistic approach that tackles the problem from multiple angles.
So we've talked about the incident itself. We've gone pretty deep into this world of private security. We've touched on some broader social issues. But there's one more piece of this I want to look at, like, what about the aftermath of all this? How might this shooting impact Solo Sandton moving forward?
Right. That's an important question because there's no doubt that this event has really thrust Solo Sandton into the spotlight, and for all the wrong reasons. And even if they weren't directly responsible for what happened, it will likely have some pretty serious repercussions for them.
Right. I mean, we see that happen all the time with businesses. Yeah. When there's a high-profile act of violence that happens, it can really tarnish their reputation, lead to loss of customers' revenue,
Yeah.
in some cases even force them to shut down.
It's the power of perception. People want to feel safe, and when they go out and a tragedy like this happens, it completely shatters that sense of security. And in the world of social media, that negative publicity can spread so quickly, making it even harder to recover from.
And we've already seen some of that, in the forum discussions and comment sections online about Solo Sandton. People are expressing, shock, sadness, anger, even saying that they would never go back there. It's understandable, but it really shows you how these events have these ripple effects.
Absolutely. It's not just about the business itself. It's about the wider community, that sense of unease and fear that something like this can generate. And of course, we can't forget about the human cost, the lives lost, the families and loved ones who are left behind, the trauma that's inflicted.
It's a reminder that these aren't just, abstract issues that we're talking about.
Yeah.
They have real consequences for real people.
Yeah.
So what can Solo Sandton do at this point to try and rebuild trust and move forward after something this devastating?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging the tragedy and expressing genuine remorse for what happened. Transparency is also going to be key. They need to be open about their security protocols and really show a willingness to learn from this and make the necessary changes.
Right. So taking responsibility and showing a commitment to creating a safer environment.
Exactly. And that might involve reviewing their security procedures, enhancing staff training, or even reconsidering some aspects of their business model. If that late night transition from a restaurant into more of a bar or a club atmosphere is creating a higher risk environment, they need to be willing to address that.
It's tough because they have to find that balance between protecting their business interests and prioritizing the safety of their patrons and the community.
It is, but it's an essential balance to find. They need to communicate clearly the steps that they're taking to address these concerns. And ultimately, it's going to take time and consistent effort to really rebuild that trust.
So it seems like this is just the start of a very long and complicated process for Solo Sandton and for Johannesburg as a whole.
I think you're right. This incident has exposed some very deep-seated issues, and it's going to require a collective effort from everyone involved to really address them.
It's been quite a ride going through all of this information. We've gone from shock and sadness to now grappling with these huge issues of security and inequality and the role that these private companies play in shaping public safety. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, and that's the nature of these deep dives. We peel back the layers, we explore all these different perspectives, and we try to make sense of events that often leave us with more questions than answers.
But I think there's real value in that process, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about seeking understanding, challenging our own assumptions, and engaging in those difficult conversations.
I agree completely. Those conversations are crucial if we want to build a more just and equitable society.
Well said. And we've covered a lot of ground today, but there are a few threads I still want to pull on when we come back.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how media coverage shapes public perception of events like this, and whether this incident can be a catalyst for real change in South Africa.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about the incident itself, the whole world of private security, and the broader societal issues that are, kind of connected to all of this. But I think there's another angle that we need to consider, the role of the media in all of this.
Right.
We're relying on news articles, social media posts, video footage. All of that stuff really shapes our understanding of what went down at Solo Sandton.
Absolutely. The media plays such a huge role in framing these events. The way they choose to tell a story, the language they use, the images they show, it all influences how the public perceives what happened.
And it's not just traditional news outlets anymore, right? You've got social media, which adds like a whole other layer to this whole thing. I mean, we've seen such a range of reactions to Svamandla's death online. Some people are celebrating, some are mourning, some are expressing anger at the whole situation. It shows you how quickly information and opinions can spread, often with, little regard for accuracy or context.
It's the double-edged sword of the digital age, right? Social media can be this powerful tool for sharing information and connecting people, but it can also be a breeding ground for misinformation and harmful narratives.
Right. It's like everyone becomes a commentator,
Yeah.
and so hard to filter out all the noise and figure out what's reliable.
It is.
It makes you realize how important it is to be critical of the information that you come across. Think about the source, be aware of potential biases, all of that.
Media literacy is more important than ever. We can't just passively consume information. We need to be able to evaluate it.
Totally. And even beyond just the information itself, there's the way that the media presents things.
Right.
I was noticing in some of the YouTube videos that you sent, there was a lot of tension between the reporters and the security personnel at the scene, of the shooting reporters being told to back off some, even being criticized for filming. It all kind of adds to the drama of the situation.
Yeah, and it highlights the challenges that journalists face when they're trying to cover these really sensitive events. They have a responsibility to inform the public, but they also have to be respectful of the victims and their families and make sure that they're not interfering with any ongoing investigations. It's a tricky balance to strike.
It really does make you wonder, how much of what we see is the actual event and how much is shaped by the lens that it's being presented through.
That's a valid question to ask. We need to be aware that every story is filtered through these multiple perspectives.
Okay, so we've talked about the complexities of the incident, the security landscape,
Yeah.
the media's role. But as we wrap up here, I want to kind of circle back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea that maybe this tragedy could be a catalyst for positive change. Is there hope that something good can come out of something so awful?
I think there's always hope, and sometimes it's these kinds of tragedies that force us to confront these uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. They make us ask these tough questions and demand better.
There was a forum post you sent that really stuck with me. It talked about the need for a conversation about the kind of society that South Africans want to build. It's a big question, but I think it's incredibly relevant here.
Absolutely. It's essential. This incident really lays bare so many interconnected issues: gun violence, security culture, economic inequality, respect for the rule of law. It's an opportunity to have these honest conversations about these challenges and work together to find solutions.
I was really struck by the interview with Chet Thomas, the crime expert.
Yeah.
He talked about the need for the police to be more proactive in tackling crime. Don't let the criminals gain the upper hand. It's a tough stance.
Yeah.
But I can see why it resonates with so many people who are feeling vulnerable and frustrated.
Absolutely. It speaks to these anxieties that many South Africans feel about crime and the effectiveness of law enforcement. They want to feel protected. They want to see that the system is working to keep them safe.
But he also emphasized the role of PSRA, saying that they need to step up and regulate the private security industry more effectively. And of course, he acknowledged those underlying issues of poverty and inequality that fuel so much of the violence in the first place.
Yeah, it's a complex problem that really requires a multifaceted approach. There's no quick fix. There's no one solution. It's about acknowledging the interconnectedness of all these issues, addressing the immediate symptoms, but also working towards these long-term systemic changes.
So as we close out this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listener will walk away with?
Well, I think it's important to remember that even in seemingly safe spaces, tragedy can strike, highlighting the need to be vigilant and have that critical eye towards security practices. I think it also underscores how blurry those lines are between private security and public safety. prompting us to question how we balance that individual protection with the well-being of society as a whole.
Yeah.
And finally, I think it emphasizes the importance of media literacy, especially in today's world, where information can be so easily manipulated and distorted, especially in the digital world.
Those are some really powerful takeaways, and this deep dive has shown us that even a seemingly isolated incident like this can reveal so much about the broader challenges that a nation faces. It's about connecting the dots, peeling back the layers, asking those tough questions.
Exactly. Through explorations like this, these deep dives into the complexities of the world around us, that we can begin to understand how interconnected everything is and hopefully work towards some meaningful change.
Well said. And to our listener out there, we hope that this deep dive has given you a more nuanced understanding of the Solo Sandton shooting and the broader issues it raises. But the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep asking questions, keep seeking information, and most importantly, keep engaging with your community to create a safer, more just world for everyone.
Couldn't agree more.
Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.